franchise is aiming to make that leap from the second dimension into the third, there's a lot of factors that you'd have to consider, mainly adding a Z-axis or analog sticks or various control functions. It's a lot more than simply taking what worked in a two-dimensional plane and applying that in an area with a kind of projected sense of perspective. Contra first tried this in the late 90s with Legacy of War.
It isn't so much that Legacy of War is a bad game because it's different, rather, it didn't try to be different enough. I'm still trying to figure out why jumping exists. In the 2D Contra games, jumping made sense. It gave you better vantage points, and it gave you ways to evade enemy fire. In this game, because they try to keep the core philosophy the same as the 2D games, dispatching bosses or hitting core weak points feels significantly slower because there's no real feel of accuracy, depth, or cohesion.
See, the Contra adventure would also try 3D levels as well, but the execution was way more than clunky. It was like Siphon Filter had gagged on Resident Evil's tank controls.
Following 2002's adrenaline-pumping boss rush Shattered Soldier, Neo Contra returns in 2004 and brings the series once again to a 3D plane, but this time with a more ironed-out philosophy. This would appear to be Takayuki Ando's first and only director credit. As a direct sequel to Shattered Soldier, Bill Riser awakens 2,000 years in the future, placing this as the furthest canonical game in the Contra timeline. With his new partner, an alien hybrid Genbei Yagyu, they must destroy the Neo-Contra threat and dispatch the hostiles.
Now, before I proceed any further, I've got to address this cover art here, done by legendary comic book artist Jim Lee. This is the kind of metal stuff that I felt that more Contra games should have used. I really think that the style of this fits the attitude of the series. And then there's Genbei Yagyu himself. I'm a huge fan of Yagyu Mitsuyoshi, and references to the Honorable Swordsman are an easy way to pander to me, so I unapologetically give that high marks for that alone.
Doesn't take a whole lot to win this weeb over.
Not listening to you, you spinal mane.
One of my positives about the gameplay I'm going to get out of the way right now, something I've asked the Contra series to do, was to give me something that felt like playing the entries on the NES. Nothing wrong with the boss rush nature of the games like Hardcore and what they became and such, but I always felt like that they weren't levels per se. They were more like endurance rounds, more or less intermediaries before another mini-boss. Neo Contra is built around mostly one big boss battle and maybe a couple of smaller, mid-tier bosses in between, but the big boss battle was always at the end of the level. There are obstructions to fight through, yet there's an escalation that ends in a crescendo. This gives Neo Contra a flow rather than a mad sprint. Taking a cue from its predecessor, weapons aren't acquirable power-ups found on the map screen. Rather, the weapon layout comes in sets that you can select before you go into battle, each varying to suit your style of run and gun. The three initial sets offer a version of the standard gun, a combustion-based power weapon, and a lock-on missile that attacks airborne targets. As you proceed through the game and certain conditions are met, more layouts become available that include the Vic Viper ring laser from Gradius 5. Some of these weapon sets, I feel like I'd like them more if you had the options to mix and match your itinerary, very much like Gradius 3 or something. Set B, for example, has high damage output from the Flame Whip and the Charge Shot, but it's very high demand for accuracy, slow firing speed, and lack of range made me choose this the least.
Or maybe I'm just biased because it's my gaming-long tenure of having terrible aim. This is why I main Lucio in Overwatch.
Back to the controls. Neo Contra does away with the ability to jump. As previously stated, it's not needed. Lock-on weapons serve as your primary anti-air and are activated by triangle, with square using your main gun. Now, while this simplifies matters, I think it would have been better suited for the shoulder buttons to fire your weapons instead of cycling through them. You can only use one weapon at a time, so I wouldn't expect something like dual fire, but in heated moments when I want the best gun for the job, it's probably one slot away. I've had quite a few inadvertent deaths because I selected the wrong option and I just found myself clicking the button faster than I anticipated.
So though it's not quite as run and gunny as previous Contra games, and it has a little bit more of a methodical approach. I mean, if you're a fan of the old games and you're trying to play this one, the two philosophies are just going to wind up mashing into each other, so it takes a little bit of getting used to.
L2 and R2 programmed as your attack would also have freed up the right analog stick to man your aiming. Instead, the right stick isn't utilized at all, much to my surprise. The movement functions well enough, I find that it's a little hampered. A new skill I do like is Evasion, which when timed right gives you invincibility. This is much better than the standard dash and more preferable. That leaves you vulnerable and unable to attack if you use it carelessly. Visually, Neo Contra runs on a slightly tweaked version of the engine Shattered Soldier uses, so the graphics and animation are very similar. Under normal circumstances, I'd trash a game for adopting a muted color palette, but the dry, dystopian wasteland is rather fitting for this.
Well, I never! What? You think you can equal the great plant Contra? Just who do you think you are?
Equal? Hardly. A pansy like you isn't even a decent warm-up.
When it comes to the music and sound production, Neo Contra I feel like I'm very split on. It doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't sound like Contra. I kinda miss the heavy guitar riffs from Shattered Soldier. Composer Sota Fujimori decided to inject some DDR electronic dance tunes that are very tasty, but I don't want to dance while playing Contra.
Or do I?
No!
And while Shattered Soldier had text boxes for a lot of its dialogue, Neo included voice acting and starring voice talents like Kirk Thornton, Doug Stone, and Wendy Lee. The dub work itself is done decent enough, but it feels more like talented people have been asked to read the corniest dialogue ever, and it's not... It's good bad. It puts me in the mind of a lot of that dub work from the mid to late 90s.
What? How do you know about me? And who the hell are you?
My. What a cold reception. Now, don't tell me you've forgotten.
No. It can't be. Lucia.
What? This is the legendary Bioroid you fought alongside with?
What do you think you're doing, Lucia? Why are you siding with them?
Poor Billy.
Oh, Billy.
It wasn't supposed to be.
Lucia. Lucia. Lucia! I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
When it comes to challenge, Neo Contra isn't a slouch. The percentage counter returns from its predecessor, and your kill rate, lives lost, and continued use factor into which ending you unlock. Naturally, the less lives you use, the less that counts against you. Your initial life tally starts out at a limit, roughly around 3 or 5, but gradually increases the more you play. Essentially, the more game overs you get, the higher power level you get, so I guess that makes this game a Super Saiyan! That does provide a little bit of leniency and increases its replay value, as I find myself keeling over at a high rate while adjusting to the perspective and layout and such. I can't prove this, but if you told me that the staffers at Konami began designing the Contra series exclusively towards speedrunners, I'd totally believe you. This was that period that predates the patented Dark Souls style of difficulty. Contra had a way of heightening one's reflexes. In the fights against Lucia, it can get quite annoying as her attack patterns are a little tricky to read due to depth perception. At least that's my take on it.
So how do I feel about this Contra game as a whole? Graphically, it has some polish to it, although it doesn't look too much better than Shattered Soldier. There are some interesting level designs and camera angles that make things appear really dynamic. Plus, I really love that stage that starts out with the characters running on top of propeller blades. That is awesome. 8 out of 10. As far as the controls go, I could probably see people being very split on this one because I am too. There's a lot that's pretty creative about it. It begs to be a twin-stick shooter, and granted this is 2004, but it really makes little sense that you can't use the right analog stick, not even to adjust camera angles or whatnot. As I said with like the lock-on anti-air missiles and some fidgeting with like the dodge moves, it feels a little stiff and mechanical in some areas, but it plays fluid enough. It might be hard to sink your teeth into this one if you're just learning it and expecting a traditional Contra experience, so I could probably see this being the most polarizing aspect of the game. I'm going to give it a very fair 5 out of 10. I think it's something that can be learned how to play. The question is whether or not the changes will keep you sticking around for it. Music production and sound. I think that the soundtrack is solid, just not for a Contra game. Some of the DDR-style dance tunes are pretty cool, and that main theme is pretty awesome. The voice acting is wacky enough, as I mentioned before, and it kind of fits what I think has become Contra's, or rather comic booky, cheesy atmosphere. So I give it a pretty modest 6.5 out of 10. And finally, as far as creativity goes, I think that this sort of quasi-overhead style of Contra game that kind of plays a little bit like the 2D levels from the overhead 2D levels from Super C, and I'm going to even throw a little bit of Gauntlet in there. I think that it's pretty good. Considering that something like Rogue Core probably took some inspiration for this, I can see Contra venturing down this path of having alternate options of maybe making a traditional 2D style game like the current Blazing Chrome. Blazing Chrome really captures that Contra spirit very well, probably even better than maybe what something like Rogue Core was going for. So does this make this better than traditional Contra? No, it's kind of hard to do so, especially with a game like Blazing Chrome, probably giving longtime fans of the series more of what they ask for. But I think that this style of 3D Contra game has proven that it can coexist as something of an alternative. I have no problem watching a franchise change or experiment ways to evolve. I don't love Neo as much as Shattered Soldier, but I think it's a pretty solid game in and of itself. When I play a game like Contra Rogue Core, I can see the influence coming from this. Or at least that's what I'm pretty sure that the director was going for. I kind of find it a touch dated because I played Helldivers back in 2016 quite a bit, and I've kind of been spoiled by modern twin-stick style action, so that might be the only real hit on it. This game does feel a little bit like a time capsule, but I think considering the leaps and bounds that it made over the last time this series tried venturing into 3D, I still give it high marks. I'd give it a respectable but a flawed 7 out of 10 overall. I think going back and tinkering with this, you might find something pretty neat as an experiment. But if you're an old-time Contra junkie, this might not wet your whistle unless you're open to a little bit, unless you're willing to open your mind to something a little different.
Oh, gobbledygook. Neo Contra this, Legacy of War that.
I couldn't help but notice that in all of your Contra rambling, you've left one game with that particular title off your list.
Nope. No, I didn't.
Oh, yes, you did. And since you want to be the mincing little quasi-journalist that you are, I did you a little favor. You can thank me later.
No, really? That's great. That's all I intended to discuss. You don't need to bring up anything else other than... Man! Why? The very second I'm committed, I'm pointing everybody in the direction of the 3-foot skeleton.
What the? That was a truly valiant effort. Really most entertaining.
Who are you?
Isn't it obvious? I am the Supreme Commander of Neo-Contra.
Commander? You must be Master Contra.